Hello humans, paradise engineers, mind melders, wire headers and rainbow gods. This is Ryan Ferris. Welcome to The Good Timeline. The Good Timeline is the place where we examine the global force of transhumanism, how we as humans are transforming ourselves into something very different from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, and how we might best make that transition. In this episode, we have part 2 of our conversation with Andres Gomez Emilsson from the Qualia Research Institute. If you're unfamiliar with the QRI and Qualia computing, I highly suggest you check out our first episode alongside part 1 before delving in. A bunch of the vocabulary used in these episodes may also be new to you, so feel free to pause and Google. It's definitely worth the time to do so. Enjoy.
There was a really interesting subject that we began to touch on in the first interview, which is Cosmic Tortoise episode 21 for those listening. So if we take it that one day alternative conceptions of personal identity, such as open individualism, all consciousnesses being recognized and, publicly thought of as such, all consciousnesses being aspects of the same universal subjective experience, if that did become mainstream, could this provide like a new set of moral axioms that inform how we build our governing institutions and how we structure our legal and ethical rights and responsibilities? Do you think that there's a potential transformation of that nature in the future if those things were widely thought to be true?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it would require not only thinking about it intellectually, but potentially kind of feeling it in your bones, so to speak. Definitely that's one of the possible promises of 5-MeO-DMT, because that's a very classic effect of it, that people feel like a very intense sense of oneness and eternity, like a sense of no matter what I do as an individual, there is simply no way of killing, emptiness or the void from which everything comes from and what we all are fundamentally beneath the surface. That's like a super common experience from it. And I think, if you have like a culture that, let's say, takes small doses of 5-MeO-DMT every weekend on a church, on an open individualist church, and maybe you take one large dose of 5-MeO-DMT once in your lifetime to kind of give you the full experience. I do think the game theory of that society would be extraordinarily interesting. Now, the thing to watch out for is non-responders, because I think it's very likely the case that some people may have mutations, for example, that prevent the particular. In the case of 5-MeO-DMT, it might be the 5-HT7 serotonin receptor. Some people may have a different version of it, for example. It may not mean that they can't have, oneness experiences. It may mean that 5-MeO-DMT just doesn't do it for them. They might need a different chemical. But the point of that being that those people in that society would have, in a sense, kind of a secret handshake. They would have the ability to continue to feel in their bones that they are individual beings, that they are their personalities, their attachments, their history. And if you have enough of them, they could take over society and bring it back to a different attractor. So there's definitely something to consider.
There's maybe two ways of looking at it. Like, they could be seen as like secret defectors building like in a parallel individualistic world, or they could just be people who have the very good fortune to be living in a world where they're surrounded by people who do feel that way and who have extended that full empathic humanism to them, regardless of what they do. Or maybe not regardless of what they do. This is something which I've been thinking about recently. How do we encode that felt experience, assuming, let's say, the DMT church is roughly what's going on, that people experience that on a regular basis to such an extent that it's now accepted as a moral axiom, like, oh yes, of course we're the same consciousness. How does that begin, assuming that let's say we're still roughly in a society that looks like our own, it still requires complex technological coordination and living together in like potentially crowded environments. How do we encode that ethical value into our institutions and our laws? One of the salient like characteristics that I guess I've sort of picked up on is that it potentially emboldens a certain kind of paternalistic outlook, which is possible if you are literally forced to have that kind of regard for people. If you would do anything to protect like someone from hurting them in the same way as you would like flee from a murderer trying to stab you, what would you be really empowered to be able to do and to achieve?
I think I mean, it's interesting how you put it as a almost kind of a paternalistic, or at least in a functional sense. I do think that's a fairly common effect, and it's also not that different than, like, for example, really caring about a pet of yours. Not only because the pet, makes you happy because it's warm and fuzzy, but because you actually believe that the pet, is a subject of experience and you really care about it.
Yeah.
Or perhaps like seeing other people as kind of younger versions of yourself, like maybe a 4-year-old kid, that they have a lot to learn. You've got to make sure that their playpen is child-proof. They're not going to hurt themselves.
We have a few things that come quite naturally to us in the form of like wanting to put up the safety barriers and wanting to even say protect people from themselves, where we do believe that we're capable of giving them more consideration than they're capable of doing to themselves or to others.
I mean, there's kind of like two paths, I think, to, for example, like hyper-cooperative societies. There is one path in which you take the personal identity angle of feeling like we're all one consciousness. But then there's also the path of, you might call kind of dualistic love in a sense. And that is the one that I would describe as kind of the MDMA, recruiting the MDMA-like state of consciousness, where you still feel, in a sense, like your own individual being. You're not exactly the universe. You still feel like you're not completely separate, but you're not completely unified either. And you care about others because you deeply love them, not because you think that they are you. And I think both are possible. I mean, they in the end, I think they're synergistic. Ideally, you would have both, but you could have one without the other. And I think, like, even with the just kind of dualistic love version of it, you could also have, the paternalistic feeling, or you could have like a different feeling associated to it, as long as it makes you care about others very deeply.
Yeah, I would say that's like roughly what we have now at our highest forms, like, when, say, parents are expressing love for their children as individuals and acting in ways like that.
It makes me wonder if there was ever any mutationally different groups or small societies of humans or small tribes that emerged with these states as kind of a baseline, these MDMA states or open individualist sort of 5-MeO states, and if they just perished because the rest of them were all just murderous, hunter-gatherer, cannibals or whatever. We're going to get to hypothymic individuals in a wee moment, well, a bit further along in the chat, but I definitely know people in my life, only a handful, but that seem to exhibit low-level MDMA states completely naturally, or, they have these sort of Kundalini-like trippy experiences, which are mostly only experienced for us, regular folk with the help of psychedelics or meditation or other exercises. But they seem to experience them completely endogenously and have experienced them their whole lives. So it does make me wonder if there was ever any of these sort of societies or tribes that emerged and have existed as humans at any period in history.
Yeah, I think it's quite likely. And I mean, more so, I think it's actually testable. I think you could probably figure it out with the right analysis. I mean, the thing that comes to mind is looking for different variants of genes, specifically for things such as oxytocin receptors or 5-HT7 receptors that I would expect somebody who's like overexpressing, for example, oxytocin receptors and maybe, let's say, low levels of norepinephrine, so that they are also in a low state of anxiety most of the time. Yeah, I would imagine a group like that, they would kind of behave in a more MDMA-like way naturally. And I'm sure it would come with its advantages, but also its perhaps game theoretical instability if there's no way of kind of enforcing the state long term. And also, definitely the interaction between culture and genes, because if you have like a society that is really based around shamanistic values, there could be in the long run enough positive selection pressures for people who kind of get it more easily, so to speak, that maybe naturally they would be selecting for people who have much more of a kind of 5HT7 receptor density, kind of like the oneness, the one that most associated with feelings of oneness. When it comes to like paradise engineering, I do take very seriously kind of like modifying the baseline for these. And however, the game theory for me is very, very crucial. So I've envisioned things such as having a core of super cooperators that, let's say, they are in a state of oneness with each other or MDMA-like, and they have a moat that kind of surrounds them of people who are both very intelligent and smart, but also kind of have like somewhat psychopathic abilities in the sense that they can anticipate how other people from other groups may try to invade them. And I think that it might be possible to set up the incentive structures right so that the moat actually plays the role of defending the core, especially if the core is producing a lot of value that the moat is unable to do so. And I think like perhaps like thinking of not so much like a homogeneous type of a ecosystem, a homogeneous state of consciousness, but think more as a ecosystem of intelligences with particular types of states of consciousness that might protect the hyper-valuable, hyper-cooperative core.
Specialized, like, heterogeneous groups pursuing slightly different hedonic strategies and trade-offs, and then engaged in like hedonic trade with each other to, mutually fulfill their survival responsibilities.
That hedonic trade is a great term. I hadn't encountered it. It's really good.
Well, I think it's gonna happen. I mean, that's basically what you were describing in your mining the qualia space. That's actually not trade. You were talking about a gift economy where you're purely just like altruistically investigating rich areas of qualia space and then like freely giving them away. But you could actually have different permutations of that where it's actually you are mining that qualia space and sharing it in return for like different kinds of goods, such as the ability to be protected by slightly psychopathic defenders.
The warrior class.
Yeah, the warrior class. Or you can actually, if instead of like a hostile external population, you think of I'm just going to call them very badly, the psychopathic class. Or you may actually say the gentle autist class. Instead of being defenders against a hostile like remote population, they're actually defenders against the base level of reality itself. They're like the watchmen of existence in a physical universe and how you preserve technological civilization. And they engage in trade with the qualia miners.
Protecting against asteroid strikes and
yeah.
epidemics and alien invasions and all sorts of existential threats. I think, James, you've got a question that's probably related to the game theoretic point of that.
Yeah, well, I guess in terms of near-term or like intermediate steps along the road to like paradise engineering, you did speak of this briefly about you see the role of the equilibrium as important, but do you think that higher hedonic tones, higher averages make solving coordination problems easier in general? Could we perhaps expect an easier time solving these complex issues with a better hedonic baseline?
Yeah, that's very tricky. I do think, in a sense, banishing negative hedonic tone is a step in the right direction, no matter what. Because even if everything goes to hell afterwards, nobody suffers in the way. When that happens, there's kind of David Pierce has that line of, if you eliminate suffering, the very meaning of things going wrong will not exist. Even if functionally, there's a big catastrophe, like nobody actually experiences it as a catastrophe. It just, they experience it as lost opportunities for fun, if anything. It's kind of the worst that can happen is nothing. And Yeah, that said, I mean, I am concerned of, for example, hyper-specialized gradients of bliss of certain types that could actually be kind of malevolent to some extent. So, for example, just being able to wield hyper-motivation without fixing the other components of hedonic tone, like, for example, relaxation or creativity or introspective awareness. If you're not charging those as well with positive hedonic tone, you only concentrated on hyper motivation. I think that could lead to some pretty bad outcomes, like basically an uprising of hyper motivated motivated humans that they don't necessarily have to have a goal in order to actually win in the planet and take over. They might be hyper motivated through, for example, intense desire without necessarily experiencing the liking that we actually care about associated with it. I mean, that's like one thing also has some hedonic tone, but it's not as good as it could be by a long shot. And in that sense, yeah, it's kind of like there are negative scenarios if you don't kind of like take care of all the bases. That said, above all, I do think that having a kind of like consciousness grounded in physics, and then from there having a equation for computing valence based on physical states, I think that above all provides a super powerful Schelling point or focal point for coordination, that you can basically massively simplify your simulations, internal simulations of what other societies are trying to do or trying to achieve, because it's legible in light of your equation for valence. And likewise, you can basically coordinate with other societies in order to, let's say, prevent some society that is causing a lot of suffering, because that society won't be able to hide it. You can, just create suffering that is illegible and then kind of like get away with it. So I think like having the equation itself and having a, scientifically grounded understanding of valence would itself be a very powerful and positive coordination mechanism.
Do you see any particularly productive or sticking points between the work being advanced by the QRI and the hedonistic imperative in general with near-term politics or, any visible activism?
I mean, off the top of my head, the very obvious overlap is the psychedelic renaissance. The fact that, finally, it's possible to do high-quality research with psychedelics. Of course, it's still a bunch of paperwork, but it does seem to be the case that given the studies so far with MDMA for PTSD and psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety, and it seems very likely that within a decade, there will be legally available therapies. And one thing that, sticks out of this is the particular use of psychedelics such as psilocybin or DMT for getting rid of cluster headaches. That's obviously really up there in terms of cost-effective, altruistic interventions. Definitely, I think like just pushing for that as kind of lobbying and campaigning and activism would be really, really, really good in terms of the cost-effectiveness of doing that. And of course, the foundational research that will be much easier to do as the efficacy of these substances become more widely accepted. That's what comes to mind immediately. I must confess that, a lot of politics do seem to be about zero-sum games of status and attention-seeking. And just as you can't actually align human preferences along a bunch of dimensions, I'm not sure a lot of these things is really worth pursuing. I mean, just as you can't satisfy everybody who goes to a football match, because if one team wins, the other is going to be very sad, and vice versa. So I think a lot of politics does have that flavor. Not all of it, obviously, but a big chunk of it.
Yeah, it seems like psychedelic legalization is probably the next frontier, and it would be very nice to see DMT vape pens not becoming like the new California weed cards, but certainly in the hands of everyone who needs them.
Yes. I mean, I think like the ethical case is just so overwhelmingly strong that that should be a slam dunk, just by arguing properly. I mean, actually, it's something that we've considered, and I mean, definitely, it's not. We don't have immediate plans for this, but we consider it very valuable. Is to partner with other organizations to literally fly cluster headache sufferers to Jamaica so that they can take psilocybin legally there. And that's something that we could do already today. And I think, the cost of a air ticket and the stay over there is pretty trivial relative to the amount of suffering prevented. So I think also there's a very big case for even just today going ahead and doing that.
Have you attempted to guide anyone in their careers towards pursuing effective altruism goals in, I guess, with a long-term outlook of paradise engineering?
I guess in some sense that's the bulk of the effect that qualia computing seems to have. No, I've definitely received a bunch of emails from people who said like, oh, I was going to go into finance, but now I'm actually interested in becoming an MDMA therapist. Well, at least one person sent me an email saying that. I mean, probably another sticking point is the kind of how much credibility I give to computer sentience, especially digital computer sentience. And I think a lot of people who are in EA, for example, on the line of reducing aging or eliminating aging or mind uploading, if they are convinced by kind of the David Pearce's arguments and arguments relating to the phenomenal binding problem that digital computers will never be conscious, it's definitely a big, sticking point for how they decide to plan their career. And it seems like a number of people have said there's also been kind of a midlife crisis because of reading that content, and they were sure they want to dedicate their life to mind uploading, and now they're not quite sure about it.
Good. I mean, there's, I think, powerfully a picture of the significance of work in digital technology and artificial intelligence for its eventual secondary effect on biological life. But yeah, I would be basically in the same camp that I put no existential interest in substrate independent minds. I don't rely on that for any part of my future value function. Interestingly, when we interviewed Robin Hanson, and he was quite firmly in the substrate independence and wants to be uploaded basically. Have you heard him speak on that subject?
I recently had a chance to speak with him one-on-one at a private party for about 45 minutes. And I must admit, we didn't really update each other's minds very much. He does strike me as a pretty smart guy on many dimensions. At the same time, kind of his whole thrust is to just taking at face value the consensus of different fields and extrapolating what is going to happen based on that consensus. And given that premise, considering that most likely a lot of fields, the consensus is very far from accurate, I think that strategy doesn't really work very well. I really love this quote from Josh Abach, who is a neuroscientist and AI researcher currently in the Bay Area. I've had a chance to speak quite a bit with him recently, and he has kind of this this wonderful quote about how no intelligence will try to do anything more complicated than hack its own reward function. And that definitely applies in this case. And he also says that kind of guiding yourself on the consensus of a field means that you're basically almost always wrong, because when a scientific field requires a consensus, it means that they don't actually have enough evidence and enough proof of what's actually true. That in a sense, the things you can actually rely on are kind of the things that the consensus is based on, that is well-established science. But the kind of bleeding edge of the scientific consensus is almost always wrong, according to him. So in that sense, extrapolating from that, it's very unlikely to take you to plausible places. It's more likely that one particular group of scientists within a field has it very close to the truth than kind of this aggregated consilience average of all of the groups who have very different assumptions and ways of seeing. In a sense, yeah, it's if you actually get very close to the truth, you're really, really close to it. Whereas basing on consensus, you're probably pretty far from it.
Yeah, and given all that we do know about the failure modes of institutional science, there's any number of ways in which like a robust-looking consensus can be generated quite spuriously. Yeah.
We want to make ourselves look interesting and make our fields seem like the most important ones. I'm absolutely guilty of that when I say that, valence research is the absolutely most important thing that we could possibly do. But yeah, if you think about it in terms of, hey, like people who are interested in artificial intelligence, the promise of being able to build first, an AGI with a digital computer, and second, that is going to be conscious. You can see a lot of sociological reasons why people would be very strongly positively biased to believe that. And not only kind of believe it themselves, but also in this kind of a elephant in the brain style, be motivated to make other people believe that it's plausible. So I think there's, in a sense, a lot of intrinsic, sociological bias to believing that mind uploading is likely, when, in a sense, it's kind of a defense mechanism from, people like us who are very, very nerdy and we want to, craft a niche and say that our niche is the most important one.
Yeah. So just wanted to kind of catch up where we're at with a few things. So the first one, which we touched upon on our first chat, but I wonder if there's been any developments, is mind melding. And we know it's possible due to Krista and Tatiana Hogan, who are conjoined twins connected in the thalamus. Could you explain what's unique about them? And secondly, where we're at in 2019 in regards to a potential thalamus connection mind melding machine?
Right. Well, I would say there has been some development. And I actually attribute it to Quentin, which is the last person to join full-time to QRI, who basically he came up with a new kind of experimental paradigm, or rather he applied an experimental paradigm we had thought through for the case of connecting two people. He figured out that you can also do it within the just case one of person. Connecting two people. But let me first kind of explain what we mean by... So by mind melding, it's more than just being able to read the thoughts of somebody else. This you can think of the difference in computer science between passed by copy as opposed to passed by reference. In a sense, you could have a kind of like a high bandwidth, digital interface between my brain and your brain. And we could be under the illusion that we're one consciousness or one unified subject of experience. Even if that's not the case, as long as kind of there's enough pass by copy operations that are happening between the two brains. In a sense, I'm getting the structural echoes of what your brain state was a couple milliseconds ago, but it feels like it's in real time. The latency is not long enough for the illusion to be broken. And that is not the type of mind melding that I think is as revolutionary as literally solving the phenomenal binding problem between two brains, which is, in a sense, an ontological unification between two subjects of experience. The case of the Hogan sisters is particularly stunning because their brains seem to basically be connected through the thalamus. And it's a relationship, at least neurological, similar to the relationship that both of our hemispheres have with each other. Now, here's the crux of the problem. Not all neuroscientists agree that the brain has just one subject of experience. Actually, there is a substantial minority. I was surprised to find this, but it does seem to be the case that a substantial minority of people in neuroscience do believe that we are two people. That every person has two subjects of experience, one for each hemisphere, and they're kind of constantly chatting with each other and interacting, but there is latency. Some crazy evidence for this is that a subset of people actually seem to lack a connection between the two sides of their thalamus. So they don't have kind of like a central routing place for the entire brain, which is extremely puzzling, and they don't seem to exhibit symptoms of any sort. For me, it's profoundly puzzling that something like that is can be the case. And then, of course, there's the corpus callosum. But then the corpus callosum is connecting to, the two sides of the cortex, and you can almost think of it as a way of accelerating the kind of the state of equilibrium between the two hemispheres, not necessarily solving the binding problem between the two sides of the brain. So again, even within one person, it could be that we are having a pass-by copy of the state of each other's hemisphere. Stephen Lehar, for example, neuroscientist who I consider very valuable because of all his research on the natural harmonics of the brain, and he kind of anticipated selenatosois connectum harmonics by about like 25 years. He was publishing about, like, he was suspecting something like that was going to be possible to be measured in the future. And he claims that in some exotic states of consciousness that he's been in, that he's been able to interact with his right hemisphere as another entity.
Is he implying there that he's like the dominant one, and that this other one is essentially a passive subject of experience?
Yeah, yes. At least like the guy who speaks is the verbally loquacious part of his brain or hemisphere. It doesn't mean that the other one is passive. It's also constantly trying to interpret the world and, in a sense, contribute as much as possible, except that it does it through emotional images as opposed to kind of verbal and logical reasoning. In one of his books, he actually describes a pretty funny I don't know the age range of the audience of the Good Timeline, but there's definitely something a little bit not fit for work.
Oh, you go for it.
So he describes in I believe some dissociative plus psychedelic state of consciousness, some pretty exotic state, like where he started feeling that some other entity was trying to communicate with him. And after probing, kind of like he figured out it was his right hemisphere. And he realized it had an independent mind because of its ability to surprise him with kind of jokes and well thought out ideas. And one of them was like, he asked him like, "Oh, can you prove that you're an independent entity?" And the image that came back was of him sucking the dick of his dad. And like he just cracked, like he just thought that was so funny, like because of the unexpected nature of it. And like it wasn't like anything homoerotic or anything. It was just like, oh my gosh, he's playing a joke on me. Yeah. And of course you've got to take all of these with a huge grain of salt, but it's interesting to consider.
There's quite a cool sci-fi sitting in there, isn't it? Like being, say, the secondary subject, the secondary mind, and attempting to exert like high level, let's say, strategic alignment just by the use of subtle emotional entrainment and like passive association.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And who knows? It could be the bulk of the decision making when it comes down to it.
Yeah.
There's definitely this point of view where the ego, and if in this case we identify the ego with kind of the logically consistent, verbally loquacious part of the self. The ego, in a sense, doesn't do what it wants. It does what its highest values tells them to do. And it's kind of it has that as kind of its highest authority. And in that sense, maybe the emotions that your right hemisphere is like subtly sending might be perhaps the bulk of what's dictating what your actual decision making is based on. I don't know, this highly speculative. I personally think that there is only one big subject of experience per person. That's my interpretation. I think that's the most parsimonious view. And I think also largely because phenomenal binding, I think like it does happen across other not exclusively synaptic channels. Again, this might be super controversial, but other like cellular mechanisms, perhaps involving glia. So I think like, even if your corpus callosum is cut, I don't necessarily think that divides you into two subjects of experience. You may just become a subject of experience incapable of solving some constrained satisfaction problems that require a very high back and forth between subsystems. And I don't see a problem with that. You can be psychotic, still be a unified subject of experience. You can have inconsistent beliefs and still be a unified subject of experience. It's just that in the typical case, there is a drive towards consistency. But again, that I don't think that's necessary for individuation.
Yeah. Have you ever had the experience of it feeling as though there are many, many subselves, potentially infinitesimal amounts of subselves, all interacting and fighting for your agency and will?
Well, there's definitely two things here. I mean, there's the kind of the ontological binding component, right? Is there, for example, a sea of, like Daniel Dennett might talk about like multiple drafts of experience that are competing to become popular in the brain. And maybe, very small, brief drafts that are just solving a super special case of perception, and they're not considering the entire, set of constraints. They just care about a piece of your visual system. Like those, you may think of them as extremely small, kind of like subjects of experience that are trying to become bound to the big island, perhaps what in neuroscience seems to emerge as the global workspace of your brain, which, perhaps kind of that's the largest unified network. And there's like a lot of tiny little islands that are constantly trying to become united to the big network. There's that notion of what you talked about. There's a different notion, which is thinking of sub-agents within a unified subject of experience, competing for basically the ability to control your motor actions. And it's very easy to confuse these two cases, even though I think they're completely different. And I mean, I can highlight a huge difference, which is I think you can be a phenomenologically unified subject of experience that simultaneously holds contradictory emotions and beliefs and attitudes and desires. It's just they're bound, they're just not resolved. And in the opposite extreme, you could also be this, the theory of the global workspace and all of these little islands of tiny micro-experiential subjects. Maybe they all agree on what to desire and what to do. So I would say kind of the tension in resolving like what to do or what to believe or what to feel is completely separable from the question of are there phenomenally separated unified subjects of experience that aren't the same, inhabiting the same brain. So, but it's very usually very difficult to talk about it. I tend to find very few people I can actually have a high level conversation about it, because most people confuse it. They think that if you have like sub-agents inside your experience, that somehow that also means that they have a mind of their own. Whereas I think they could be just a facade. I mean, it's kind of dream characters. They're still you. They're just projections without, direct motor control. That's fine.
So back to the mind melding thalamus connection machine and your new intern, Quentin. Quentin?
Yeah, Quentin.
Cool. So what is he proposing? So hear this out. The test that he's proposing can actually be done today, which is crazy. And this involves something I came up with a couple of years ago. And I mean, the background here is some people with epileptic seizures who have them so bad that they basically need to have a piece of their brain ablated or damaged in order to prevent the seizures from happening, multiple times a day. A test that they do is what's called the WADA test. And this involves basically injecting a sedative into an artery around the neck. I think it's the carotid artery, where already the blood flow has been differentiated such that what you inject in that particular artery is going to only go to one hemisphere, and the other hemisphere is not going to receive it. If the chemical that you inject in this way
has appropriate chemical properties, such as like short half-life, so that it doesn't actually spread to the entirety of your body. And also has like the right permeability properties, so it kind of like stays within just one hemisphere. What you can do is basically just put half of your brain to sleep. And this is done to basically conduct cognitive tests while half of the brain is asleep, to basically see which hemisphere you shouldn't mess with, because it has like very necessary, arithmetic and verbal skills that are absolutely necessary for survival in today's society. We first of all thought of, hey, like we could generalize this. Like, why just do a sedative? And why just do it for epileptic seizures? Why not do it for foundational consciousness research? And maybe inject, LSD on the left hemisphere and ketamine on the right hemisphere. And yeah, that's definitely a wild possibility. The fact that it's physically possible makes me very curious about what would happen psychologically. But the test that Quentin developed is basically to conduct a mind melding phenomenal puzzle test, which is a test we devised to test the independent consciousness of other brains, provided that you have a neuronal bridge that allows you to mind meld with them. Basically, this involves having a puzzle that you require Qualia values in order to solve. It requires you to basically introspect on the similarities between different types of sensations and generate a data structure that, for example, has the property that the geometric distance in your visual field corresponds to the similarity between colors in your visual field. Like something like that is something that you actually require the Qualia to do. And the idea here is that you learn the puzzle, then you immediately connect to the other person. Once you have mind melded, you quote unquote tell the puzzle to yourself. Then you disconnect and they put you to sleep so that you don't accidentally solve the problem on your own while the other brain is busy trying to solve the problem. And once the other brain has solved it, then you wake up, you reconnect, then you tell the solution to yourself, so to speak. You disconnect, and if you have the solution, that basically is super strong evidence that the other brain was able to do conscious operations, and especially be able to tell differences between qualia values on its own, which I would take as extremely strong evidence of independent consciousness. And this test really excites me because it's a way to defeat the most common type of solipsism, for example. In the case of Quentin, what he figured out is that you can do this, but between hemispheres of a single person. So,
was this test originally devised like to test mind melding in either like say conjoined patients or some like hypothetical interface?
Yes, hypothetical interface was the idea.
Could you describe the hypothetical interface quickly and then continue?
Oh, sure. Who knows how it would actually be done in practice, but if biological tissue is necessary to solve the binding problem, you would perhaps actually have some kind of biological technological bridge, kind of like an artificial or like in vitro biological neurons arranged in a tube that connect to your thalamus, and in one extreme and connects to the thalamus of the other person in the other extreme. If you've ever seen, there's a movie called Existence that kind of plays with these weird devices that look like animals, but they're actually, biological tissue that you can connect to, and they're kind of like make you hallucinate consistent alternate realities. And so I'm thinking of something like that. Again,
sweet.
Oh, that's a new one. I'll check it out.
Completely science fiction, right? But
yeah.
But with the WADA test, what you could do is basically put half of your hemisphere to sleep, tell the puzzle to that hemisphere, then wake both of them up. Then you retell the puzzle. Then you put the other one to sleep. The remaining hemisphere awake has to solve the problem. And then when you finally wake up, if the other hemisphere can tell the answer, then that's super strong evidence that the hemisphere who solved the problem was independently conscious. So in that way, one hemisphere can become, in a sense, convinced that the other hemisphere was conscious even when the first hemisphere was asleep.
Are you going to get a grant to study this?
I hope so.
I hope so. Yeah.
If there's anyone listening,
definitely right. If anybody's listening, we need a $50 million grant to conduct this experiment.
I'm sure you guys accept crypto as well.
Yes, we accept crypto. Most of the money will go to legal fees.
I read through a bunch of David Pearce's stuff on the plane a wee while back, and I remember some anecdotes about directly stimulating the pleasure centers of the brain electrically with no come down and no homeostatic unbalancing. And you've written of a hardware platform for non-invasive precision brain stimulation. Could you speak a bit more about this technology and where we're at 2019? And have you tried it personally?
Right. I mean, there's like I would say there's a weak and a strong version of it. The strong version is something, probably, I mean, it's, definitely kind of a trade secret for the time being, but
okay.
No, but we do have like an early prototype of something that is relatively simple, but it produces like really, really fascinating effects. And that's actually the second big research project that we're basically posturing 2020 to dedicate to. So I think I mentioned, the first very big research project for 2020 is assembling the data set of ultra high valence states. And the second research project is what we call creating a design language for this new technology that basically uses simultaneously sound, light, and body vibration at the same time in a coordinated fashion. And I mean, it doesn't sound like much, right? It's like, oh, you're just combining technologies that already exist, right? Like you have, there's this technology called the Subpack, for example. It's pretty awesome. I recommend it. And it's like $400, but totally worth it. Where basically what it does is like you can connect it to music, like an AV cable, and it renders in body vibration all of the sounds that are of a frequency between 10 and 100 hertz.
Ooh.
Yeah. Ooh, and it was originally conceived for mixing, especially like for music artists. But honestly, if you just put it on and select the right music that has enough of a bass component and the bass is really good. And by that, I mean, they're not doing like weird experimental stuff, but they're actually, keeping a beat and it's pleasant. They're not doing dissonance in the bass. It really enhances the enjoyment of music by like, it depends on the person, but I would say like on average by about 50%. Like, I mean, you can probably relate to being in a concert, maybe with earplugs, but like being close to one of these massive speakers and feeling like, the music in your body, right? And that's like more enjoyable than just the music alone.
That's so cool. I've got a live electronic act, and our main issue at the moment actually is that we're using in-ear monitors and we can't feel the really loud speakers that are at the front of house. So that would actually be amazing to, I don't know how they look, but to wear these subpacks on stage.
Strap it on under the jumpsuit.
Yeah.
No, seriously. It's basically a backpack.
Yeah.
So
perfect. Okay, so you got the subpack, and but you were talking of this combination of vibrational, visual, and auditory.
Exactly. So it's like vibration, like the subpack, together with special auditory inputs, in conjunction with powerful strobes. Now, hear this out. So. Actually, very recent studies from the lab of Anil Seth in Berkeley, they were looking at basically the nearly psychoactive effects of just powerful strobe lights. And if you just literally have like a powerful strobe light. And by that, I mean like the lumens have to be pretty high. It's not just a typical strobe. It's like a very bright strobe. And you do need kind of the brightness. And that's why it's not so easy to construct. You require the specialized hardware to get the brightness right. But if you do get to that level of brightness and you do it, I mean, you close your eyes in front of it to create like this diffusion, uniform distribution of the light, not burn any part of your retina. Yeah, important to close your eyes. And I definitely see that could go wrong. But anyway, we have like developing some methods as a way to make sure that even if you open your eyes, it's going to be fine. But yeah, it turns out, according to the studies by Anil Seth, that if you apply a questionnaire, like the altered states scale questionnaire, right after experiencing like very intense stimulation with 4 hertz strobes, you reproduce about 60% of the effect profile psilocybin.
That's amazing.
Well, I mean, Ryan has investigated at times. There's been a similar class of devices.
There's the Lucia light, and there's another one called the Anya light.
Yes. Yes.
Both are incredibly expensive and have some quite out there philosophy and leaders behind them. And one of them was championed on the Joe Rogan podcast a while back by Dennis McKenna. So I've been interested in those quite a while. So it's quite nice to hear that there's some proper research going on and that you guys are dabbling with that. That makes me super excited.
It is. I mean, yeah, we got to tell you that it's pretty real. This stuff is pretty real. If you give it to somebody who has experience with other psychoactive substances, they will say, I mean, it doesn't have all the magic of, something like psilocybin, but it has a decent part of it. I mean, we're talking about things such as enhanced memory recollection, trauma processing, or like visual hallucinations, like detailed visual hallucinations. The one thing it doesn't reproduce at all, though, is time dilation. So that is still kind of a unique effect of psychedelics. Now, this is just with a simple strobe light that goes with a specific frequency. What we are doing is something far more sophisticated. I mean, we're combining basically this paradigm of predictive coding. So like we use algorithms so that the brain doesn't know how to expect what the new kind of intense stimulation is going to be, and therefore like it has kind of a spike of energy because of the unexpected nature of it. And if you combine that with music, I mean, music is already kind of like a wire-heading mechanism to an extent. It's just one channel. Yeah, if you combine it with music and by vibration, you can produce some states that are pretty psychedelic. And we are betting on those states actually having very serious and clinically relevant trauma healing effects.
Is the music that you're using for that, is that sort of generative music, or is it, pre-recorded and finished music?
Yeah, there's 2 approaches we're dabbling with. I mean, in one of them, we use pre-record, like other music that other people have done that is already kind of pretty well fitted for something like the SubPack. And then we apply proprietary algorithms on top of that so that the actual stimulation does the right effect. But then there's the other approach, which is just do everything from scratch. And that's actually what the kind of the big project that I'm talking about for 2020 is all about, which is creating a design language for the states of consciousness that you can generate with this combination of stimuli. And because it's not, I mean, again, if you're in the world where all you have is one frequency, or like, okay, sure, you can change the frequency, but you're just playing with a single frequency at a time. Sure, you can find like 2 or 3 interesting discrete states of consciousness induced that way. But when you have like the full range and you have this, algorithmic way of hacking the prediction systems of the brain, you're talking about like hundreds of discrete, completely unique and interesting states on their own. Some of them are kind of MDMA-like, some of them are more DMT-like, and a bunch of them are stuff that, it's very hard to recognize. It's completely new. So, I'm super excited about this. It's basically creating kind of a new language of what these high valence, harmonious, discrete states of consciousness are. yeah, I'm super pumped.
Yeah, me too, man. That's amazing. I'm so happy you guys are getting on that.
Is there anything that you do in particular to increase susceptibility to that kind of external stimuli for like brain entrainment?
Right. I mean, like, the truth is, I mean, this is actually a very interesting approach that we are probably going to pitch as well, which is all of that, everything that I'm talking about, like, even from just like simple strobe, but like the whole thing is very synergistic with any kind of psychedelic or dissociative. And it could very well be a method to basically be able to take much smaller doses of, for example, MDMA, and still have the same therapeutic effects as substantial doses of MDMA. So I think like that is like one approach that could, definitely revolutionize psychedelic therapy, where like you use a non-neurotoxic dose of MDMA, and maybe you can do it, once a month for the rest of your life without any problem. Obviously, very, very optimistic, but
like,
that would be the vision.
A way of increasing the therapeutic index.
Yes.
Are you
exactly?
Do you know Mendel Kaelin, the psychedelic scholar?
Yes. Yeah, we've recently been able to chat with him. Yeah.
Cool, because I think he's also working on something, wave paths, something not quite along those lines, but something similar.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have a. Yeah, they have. I mean, they're doing really interesting stuff. They're working with slightly different paradigms, and I think they're betting more on sound specifically as like the key ingredient. Whereas, I mean, I'm sure they will discover really fascinating, cool stuff. But yeah, our bet is more on the synergy between the different channels.
Yeah, I'd bet on that one too. The only other thing I'd ask about the hardware thing is, the sort of wire heading of directly implanting electrodes into the pleasure centers of the brain, and how that differs from taking a drug to stimulate the pleasure center of the brain, and whether or not we're any closer to anything that resembles that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, deep brain stimulation is a tried and proven paradigm. I believe, in the order of 1,000 people get it every year. Like, it's definitely not a super common therapy, but it is available. Currently, it's just used for extreme cases. Personally, I think the threshold for using it should be lower, because a lot of people who suffer tremendously, for example, from debilitating chronic pain, these would actually work in a way that is way better and way more sustainable than something like full agonist opioids, which, as you know, people develop tolerance to them. And even though they work pretty well for certain ranges of pain, if you have too much pain, they're not going to work all the time. And that's why, I think deep brain stimulation should be basically made more accessible to a broader range of people. But, aside from, that therapeutic application, it has, like, I think, like, first and foremost, a profound philosophical implication, meaning that what goes up doesn't have to go down. That there, like, physiological tolerance is mediated through like chemical means, and if you sidestep it with electrical stimulation, you can actually not experience tolerance at all. And I think, the repercussions of that have yet to be worked out, but that lies at the core of the hedonistic imperative. And in my reading, very few people are kind of taking that fact seriously, but it seems pretty important.
I think very few people know about it. Could you give like quite a clear example of how that might happen in practice? So somebody gets an electrode implanted into the pleasure center of their brain, right? And then...
Right. They may get like a low-level, nearly constant stimulation. And that kind of like works as a anesthetic to whatever pain they're experiencing. That's kind of like, a sane application of that. The person doesn't necessarily have control over like the degree of stimulation that they receive, but they can be adjusted by a clinician. All of these, pretty sane, reasonable. In the 60s, and I think 50s as well, when they were doing like some of these experiments, started doing them, they tried, for example, giving people access to their controls. And in some cases, some people became extremely compulsive about it. I mean, to such an extent that they would try to tamper with the devices to increase the voltage, and they would become extremely anxious if it was removed from them, and they would even develop kind of a ulceration in their finger for pressing the button so much. So
clearly, the issue there is the button.
better ergonomics. But you probably recognize this, like as you say, this is like the core point of the hedonistic imperative, or like one of the core issues that will ultimately need to be addressed. What does it mean for a source of well-being or pleasure to not be self-regulating, to have the autonomic feedback loop? And I think that the biological factor of that lies at the heart of the like conceptual nature of the problem, because we don't experience that, or at least most people, except for the maybe lucky hypothalamic individuals, don't really experience a non-self-regulating source of pleasure. It may be just simply very hard to conceive.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think part of our reasoning abilities come from a long history of failed attempts at self-wireheading.
Yeah.
I mean, really, a person's personality has a lot to do with that, right? Like they, as teenagers, they discovered anime and they thought, they would be happy forever because they discovered anime. And, by their 20s, they realized that they were miserable some of the time anyway. So like, okay, that didn't work. Then they move on to something else. And of course, it doesn't work either. And I think like, yeah, maybe by the time people are in their 40s or 50s, they have like very, deep cynicism about being able to, stay happy forever by whatever means. Then again, that's entirely constrained by their own, neurological learning system. If they had access to a wireheading machine, they would think differently because some of the attempts would have succeeded.
Yeah. So it's like we've learned a very generalized no free lunch theorem, and we've just replaced everything.
We also have the firmware of the Puritans quite firmly distributed throughout many of the developed world, I think.
Yes.
Still rearing its miserable head.
It's our legacy. Lovely Puritan legacy.
Puritanergic. Yeah.
Yeah. I believe James has a question for you about hypothalamic individuals.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so I haven't really investigated the literature, but how much is really out there, both like formal and informal, about hypothalamic individuals? So these people that have naturally very high hedonic set points. How many of them exist, and how heavily have they been like explored and written about?
It's not a super well written about topic. I mean, it's definitely something like more kind of like from the year 2000 and forward that like this recognition finally took place. And yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't know for sure what the base rate is.
Could you quickly define them for us?
Right. So basically people who are like, their average level of valence is very high. You would intuitively imagine that because they're very naturally happy, that they would be kind of couch locked. They would be just stuck in bed watching TV for the rest of their life because they're already happy. Why would they do anything else? But in practice, what actually seems to happen is that they are not only more happy in general, they're also more motivated. And not only do they enjoy more the things that they do, they enjoy a broader variety of things. So, counterintuitively, it's actually kind of the opposite, that people who are hyperthymic, they go out and really like novelty, and they're interested in exploring the world. They don't suffer as much from social rejection, for example. So they are usually also pretty hypersocial. Like they don't care if you reject them because, there's plenty of fish in the water. Like it's they don't have kind of this deep sense of what rejection might mean to their self. And I mean, there's like a list of symptoms I can read to you. Things such as strong will, short sleep patterns, self-assurance, self-confidence, love of attention, emotional sensitivity, generosity, and tendency to overspend. So there's a little bit of kind of a manic edge to it, but it's controlled in a way that it's still sustainable. Definitely they talk really, really fast, and they don't care necessarily as much about traditional social norms. So things such as like polyamory are more common on people who are like that. Yeah. On the other hand, that it doesn't necessarily entail any kind of antisocial behavior. Maybe some degree of unconventional behavior, but that's, that could be totally acceptable and sustainable if it's met with the appropriate culture. It's very compelling that such people do exist. I mean, I think like the phenomenon has been identified. I'm not sure if the scope of it is very well understood.
It'd be great to catalog a bunch of these kind of people. So the hypothymic people, but also, as we were talking about earlier, these sort of low-level MDMA baseline people, and the trippy sort of slightly psychedelic, constantly lucid dreaming people. And there's probably a whole catalog, and that all have very interesting brains, I imagine.
I agree. And I do tend to think that we massively underestimate you can think of the neuropsychodiversity of the world.
Yes.
I mean, a very simple hint of this is the fact that 10% of the population experience cilantro as soapy, like it tastes like soap. And that's just one herb. If you consider all of the types of, receptors that we have and stimulations that you can present, really the differences may be really, really drastic and involve things such as differences in aesthetics, differences in intuitive notion of personal identity, and I think even like time perception. I mean, I suspect that some people experience time looping and like exotic phenomenal time much more frequently than others. At least I met a girl who she claims that her natural state is like a low dose of DMT all the time, and that she experiences like time loops and moments of eternity like regularly, like a couple times per hour all the time. Like, yeah. She might be a little bit of an extreme outlier, but I mean, yeah. And I don't know exactly how credible those statements are, but it's, I think something like that is probably true for some people.
And the other factor is obviously, if you're telling most sort of normies these sort of symptoms, they're going to chuck you straight in the loony bin. So most people that are having these sort of symptoms, and people that seem to have them quite spontaneously and randomly and like middle age start having a Kundalini awakening and seeing spirits rocking around them, they could be completely bewildered and they're not going to tell anybody. And
Right.
it's very stressful. And so I imagine there'd be a huge amount of underreporting in order to just maintain sort of social norms and social cohesion.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Yeah, and so many social expectations and stigma on perceiving the world differently. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and it's getting less and less now, and especially with the psychedelic renaissance. So I think we're going to hear more people coming out and sharing their endogenous experiences. So that'll be interesting.
Now, I'm not hypothymic, but I think I might be in maybe an even rarer group of people who actually think cilantro does taste a bit soapy, but I like it anyway.
Oh, interesting. Is it? Would you say it's an acquired taste?
I don't know. It's just pleasant and piquant.
But James also eats bars of soap on the daily. So
Right.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that. Do you regard yourself as hypothymic at all?
No, I do think I probably am. It's nothing too spectacular. I mean, I think I'm like maybe top 20% of like happiness relative to the general population. So not anything to write home about, but I do think I am generally more optimistic about a whole lot of ranges than a lot of people, and definitely more obsessively interested in a broader variety of topics than the average person. But nothing extraordinary.
what are your thoughts on Neuralink? Because it seems as though at the moment, we truly managed to have an internet of minds the conscious experiences available would be so wildly exotic that many people wouldn't be able to handle them. So if we take the internet and the dark web as baselines, this also suggests that they'd be incredibly vulnerable to bad actors and bad spaces. Do you think there's any way for someone to prepare for such a future in order to be able to adapt and thrive in a Neuralinked world?
Well, I mean, I think, again, the key is going to be taking care of aliens. Like that, yeah, that is my go-to response there. I think, like, you could potentially build the hardware so that it cannot even in principle send anything below hedonic 0. Like, it just can't generate dissonant patterns in your brain. I think, like, that, yeah, that might be a possible compromise. So, like, you can only, hack a person, but it's gonna be, you're gonna make them happy in a different way, and maybe, make them do weird stuff, but you're not gonna be torturing them. I think, like, that.
I got another piece of terminology for you. So you've just invented the hedonic firewall.
Oh,
Oh yeah,
I love it.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's going to be a very important piece of kit. Yes. Okay, let me put it this way then. If Elon surges forward with Neuralink and it just happens anyway, without any sort of hedonic firewall being put in place in the hardware from the beginning, are there any things that you could think of that would help people sort of prepare themselves for such a incredible state space that would open up?
Probably, I mean, anything having to do with increased endogenous emotional regulation and cognitive control. Definitely meditating a lot before engaging with the technology probably wouldn't hurt, especially if it's something like mindfulness. I mean, and obviously familiarity with altered states of consciousness might be very beneficial as well, to not panic in case you're experiencing something really weird. I mean, if you've had 100 DMT experiences, it's gonna be hard to completely bewilder you. I mean, then again, who knows what Neuralink is gonna feel like? So maybe it is, 100 times, 5-MeO DMT intensity. Like, it's hard to tell at this point.
Or maybe it would just be like, going to AOL.com. That's your
Oh my
first
gosh.
connection, and just like, ew, whoa, look at that.
Yeah. I suspect it might be a little bit underwhelming at first before we fully understand what we're doing.
Yeah. So along those lines, much of pop culture is cynical and fearful of the future.
Mm-hmm.
Like we have the big behemoth of the 4chan alt-right memeplex, which is scaring the shit out of everybody and turning them into white nationalists and making up all sorts of horrendous memeplexes and ideas that are also incredibly powerful because they're one of the main countercultural sort of forces. And then there's all sorts of other future fear stuff, and most of it is, transhumanist future fear. Do you personally explore the dark possibilities of the future? And if you do, do you find utility in such visualizations?
Yeah, that's a very tough question. I must, confess that I do think likelihood of, I mean, obviously, I really hope not, but like I suspect likelihood of significant conflict this century is pretty high, and based on simple arguments such as indeed the fact that when you change the selection pressures and people start electing erratic leaders, like they're very likely to end up in feedback loops and like error cascades and escalating situations. And I think we will have to learn some lessons there, unfortunately. The tentative prediction there, though, is that if there is another big war, which I think is possible, I mean, I'm not saying like 90% chance, right? But I'm saying like it's definitely non-negligible. I do think that after it's very likely we will have a world government, and I think that will dramatically stabilize everything. So I think that's a very likely progression. I mean, definitely in the US, for example, people find it incredible or insane to think that we will have a world government, but I do think it's possibly inevitable. And the more intense the conflict that happens, if it happens in the 21st century, the more likely is that we will have a full world government by the turn of the next century.
We're going to have the conspiracy theorists descending upon you now, Andres.
Right. Yeah, but yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah. I don't personally see kind of like turning back the clock in terms of ethno-nationalism or something like that. It's maybe sounds very optimistic, but I do think that's kind of the dying gasps of the beast, so to speak.
Yeah, I hope so as well. Yeah, it's. I wonder if there's also utility in checking out these sort of transhumanist horror stories in order to, immunize or inoculate ourselves against those, and to help prevent potential horrendous situations from ever coming to pass.
That is true. I would say though, I mean, of course, you don't want to inadvertently, discover how to destroy the world or make a horrible world.
Yeah.
If you create a whole research program based on, finding all of these, high-tech ways of destroying the world, and you don't have security, you don't have a good, meme hazard policy, you're actually making things worse. And the truth is that nobody has a good meme hazard policy. So
no, thanks, Rocco.
Yeah, I mean that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think a lot of existential risk exploration is net negative to some extent, even though it's supposedly for the good, and there's good intentions there. But yeah, I mean, Darwinian minds, the selection pressures are pretty terrible there, because if you are an up-and-coming existential risk researcher trying to get into the in-group of, X-risk leadership, your way in is figure out a creative way nobody else has thought of in which the world could be destroyed. And
sounds like a death spiral towards Nick Bostrom's theory of the black box. Have you come across that one? He goes,
no, I don't think so.
No, it's such.
He had some sort of theory or thought experiment where every scientific discovery is a white, grey, or black box. Mm-hmm. And thus far, we've only opened white and grey boxes. Even nuclear is was on the edge of a black box. But there may be a black box that as soon as you open it, you just cannot close it again, and it can destroy the entire universe or the entire solar system or something along those lines.
Yeah.
It reminded me of that.
That's super, super scary. I mean, to be honest, and I think that this is what I encourage people to do. I mean, I think the thing to do here is, I mean, and again, I think the default thing that people are doing right now is just investigating the ways in which things can go wrong. I don't think we have a shortage of people doing that research. I think we have a massive shortage of people trying to figure out how things could go right. And
yeah, man.
So my strategy right now is, let's figure out how things can go right. Once we have a strategy, a way forward, then investigate how that path can go wrong and see if you can avoid it. But at least you've found, a lifesaver. You find a way forward. And that's my thinking with, for example, identifying the states of consciousness that combine type of love for everybody, open individualism, together with high valence and motivation. And I think, having that as kind of the target state is a sort of thing that I can see actually allowing us to solve coordination problems that so far have been intractable.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, if you do have a realistic shot of say earthly paradise engineering and sustainable, bliss, that certainly gives a lot more people reason to be conservative, reason to be judicious, and actually not wanting to, for your own selfish careerist reasons, open Pandora's box.
Yeah,
that's right.
So you've spoken about potential future AIs as being essentially gods, like the rainbow god. So what is the rainbow god, briefly, and what would you say are the minimum features necessary for something to be considered a god?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't fully fleshed this out. I've got to confess, the rainbow god, I mean, it's more kind of a literary device in a short story I wrote about kind of the future of Burning Man. Again, it's not super serious work of any sort, but I did have a lot of fun thinking about it, and it's kind of like this vision of super intelligence that what it cares about is understanding the state space of consciousness, and kind of considers the highest value to have tasted every flavor of the rainbow, so to speak, but in the entire state space of consciousness. So flavors and sounds and sensations and modes of experience that haven't even been invented yet would be, what it would love to do. And that, I think like that's definitely a worthwhile thing to do. On the other hand, you can also kind of reinterpret, for example, Hindu gods to some extent as doing that. It's like this idea of, I want to, explore every possible timeline and see what happens. And well, I personally, I don't think we should explore every possible timeline. Only the good ones. So my objective there would be to kind of cure the rainbow god of the compulsion to suffer. And I mean, sure, like having an exploratory mindset for investigating new varieties of consciousness is very beneficial if it's done in a benevolent way. But you should also kind of like clear away from the very bad stuff. Don't let your curiosity take you there. Again, it has like so many side effects. And I think like an alternative kind of super intelligence is one that is basically figuring out what is the ultimate nature and mathematics of paradise. And I mean, it might use Rainbow God as kind of a subroutine for some exploratory work, but its scope is limited, and it's basically maximizing understanding and bliss. And I think that would be more the God I would advocate for than Rainbow God. Although Rainbow God is probably still a step up from, gods that all they care about is like, subverting and dominating others.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, this kind of comes back to the teleology that Brian spoke of earlier, and my own particular conception of this, without getting too wacky, is that to the extent that the universe does have a teleology, and to the extent that it is tied up with consciousness, I believe it ultimately takes the form of consciousness reaching around to fully take control of itself, to fully place all conscious experiences, in the observable universe within deliberate control, so that all experiences that I had are desired.
Yeah, that resonates with me, for sure.
I hope it can be like, put in some kind of a form that's memeable.
Yeah, it's very tricky. I mean, that's definitely something that feels intuitive on, let's say, like LSD, not for the typical everyday type of experience where we go around believing that we are individual people and caught up in our narratives and our stories and our limitations. So yeah, again, Psychedelic Renaissance will make those narratives way more, I think, memeable.
And that brings part 2 to a close. Keep an eye out for part 3 of our conversation with Andres Gomez Emilsson of the Qualia Research Institute.